Good morning, second grade. Ms. Fogelman here today for your reading lesson. Let me share my screen. So we are continuing our conversation about comparing and contrasting. If you remember, comparing and contrasting means that you're finding ways that they are alike and different. Okay, to compare is finding how similarities between the two texts. Contrasting means finding differences between the two texts. When you are finding what's the same, you can use words like as, like, alike, both, have in common, similar, similarly to, and the same. When you're contrasting or finding differences, you're using words like however, but, although, contrary to, as opposed to, or instead of. All right, so the things that we're comparing and contrasting today are the two stories, Jack and the Beanpole and Jack and the Beanstalk. Let's begin with Jack and the Beanpole. Remember, as I'm reading, you're looking for ways that these two stories are alike and different, or you're comparing and contrasting them. Jack and the Beanpole. One day, Jack went to town to buy a cow. On his way, he traded his money for 3 magical beans. His mother was very mad, but he went home and planted the beans in his backyard. The beans grew and grew into a huge beanpole. Jack decided to climb the beanpole. He climbed and climbed until he finally reached the top. He saw a palace and heard the loud roar of the giant. The giant had many fancy things. Jack stole the giant's golden harp. He climbed down the beanpole and gave it to his mother. They used the harp to buy many things for their family. Jack climbed the beanpole again and again. He stole many things from the giant without getting caught. On one last trip, he decided to steal the giant's golden goose, so Jack and his mother would always have riches. Just as he was climbing down, the goose started squawking. The giant heard the noise and chased after Jack. Jack reached the ground first and ran to get a hatchet. He swung and cut the beanpole down. The giant fell to the ground with a thud. Jack and his mother lived happily ever after with the golden goose. Now here is the traditional Jack and the Beanstalk. Some of you may have heard this one before. Once upon a time, there lived a widow woman and her son, Jack, on their small farm in the country. Every day, Jack would help his mother with the chores, chopping the wood, weeding the garden, and milking the cow. But despite all their hard work, Jack and his mother were very poor with barely enough money to keep themselves fed. So Jack took their cow and walked toward town to try to sell the cow. He hadn't gone far when he met the butcher who traded him 5 magical beans for the cow. When Jack returned home, his mother became angry with him and ran off and cried. Jack ran upstairs to his little room in the attic. So sorry he was, and threw the beans angrily out the window. When Jack woke up the next morning, he looked out his window and saw a giant beanstalk. Jack, being a curious boy, started to climb the beanstalk. When he reached the top, he saw a glorious castle. As he stood and wondered at the castle, a little old woman stopped by him and told him a story of a brave knight. She said that the castle once belonged to a brave knight, but was stolen by an evil giant. The woman told him that the knight was his father and the castle and everything inside of it was his. Over a time of 3 days, Jack snuck to the castle and took back his father's prized possessions: a golden harp, a sack of gold, and a white hen that laid golden eggs. On his 3rd trip to the castle to get the hen, the giant saw him and began to chase him. Jack ran to the beanstalk, climbed down as fast as he could, and found an axe and chopped down the beanstalk, trapping the giant in the clouds forever. And so Jack, his mother, the golden harp, and the white hen lived happily ever after. Okay, so our first question says, how are the mothers in each story similar? So you're going to decide, how are the mothers the same? Then, how are Jack's actions different in the 2 versions of the story? Okay, so In the first story, it says right here that he planted the beans in his backyard. Whereas in the second story, Jack ran upstairs to his room when he was so sad and he threw the beans out the window. Also, in both stories, because in the second question or the third question, it says, oh, nope, I'm sorry. We're only finding out how Jack's actions are different in the two versions of the story. So let's see what else. In the first story, when he swung and cut the beanpole down, the giant fell to the ground with a thud. Whereas in the second story, he chopped the beanstalk down and the giant was trapped in the clouds. So in one, the giant died because of Jack's actions. In the second one, the giant was caught in the clouds because of Jack's actions. So now, in both stories, this is not one of the questions, but let's talk about it. In both stories, Jack took their cow and tried to sell it, but he ended up trading it for 5 magical beans. And his actions there then caused the beanstalk to grow, and he climbed the beanstalk in both stories and was stealing things from the castle. Now, in the first story, he was stealing things from the castle because the giant was evil and he wanted to make sure that he and his mother were well taken care of. And so he was stealing things from the castle to make sure he and his mother were taken care of. In the second one, Jack is the son of the knight who used to live in the castle that the giant stole. So Jack was stealing back the things that that the giant took from his father. All right, so the last question says, how are the giants in each story similar but different from each other? Okay, so that's like what I was just talking about. In the first, they're both giants, of course, and they both chase Jack, so that's how they're similar. They're both evil giants, that's another way they're similar. But they're different because in the first story, the giant just lives in the castle. But in the second story, the giant stole all of the castle and everything inside of it from Jack's father, the great knight. So that's how they would be different. All right. So today in Shobi, you will see this worksheet. If you paid attention and were listening, these questions should be easy for you to answer. Please remember that you're supposed to use parts of the story to prove your answer. So take information from the story that you learned and make sure that you are putting that into your answer. Make sure your answers are in complete sentences and that you are including everything from the story. No 1- and 2-word answers, okay? All right, have a good day.